Welcome to today's webinar presented by MEOPAR and the Canadian Coastal Resilience Forum. MEOPAR is a national network of academic researchers, students, government scientists, and partners working together on marine issues. Today's topic is Room for Rivers and Voices, a comparison of the Room for the River approaches in Alberta and the Netherlands. My name is Shari Kotar, and I'm the coordinator for the Canadian Coastal Resilience Forum, a community of practice in the Climate Risk Research Group at the University of Waterloo. I will also be your moderator for today's session. The format for today's webinar will be a presentation followed by a moderated Q&A session. Our presenter for today's webinar is Evelina Bogdan. Evelina holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Alberta, Canada. She is currently a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Waterloo. Her research focuses on how diverse and competing views and interests are navigated in policies and practices addressing socio-environmental problems, especially related to flood risk governance. To examine these complex issues, Evelina applies an interdisciplinary lens and innovative stakeholder engagement processes, such as role-playing serious games with decision makers. She's working alongside Dr. Daniel Henstra, Dr. Jason Thistlethwaite, and the FloodGov team who are conducting comparative case studies in Canadian cities on flood risk governance arrangements to evaluate their effectiveness in a changing climate. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to Evelina.
Thank you for the welcome, Shari, and also thank you to the participants for taking time out of your busy schedules to attend today. My name is Eva Bogdan, or my nickname Evelina, and as Shari mentioned, I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Waterloo. I'm excited to share with you today about my doctoral research comparing the Room for the River approaches in Alberta, represented by the blue flag on the left-hand corner, and the Netherlands, the flag on the right-hand corner. While my presentation focuses on managing river or riverine flooding, the findings are applicable to coastal communities since many face flooding risks from rivers. Also, these findings identify some of the factors that contributed to the success of the Room for the River program in the Netherlands that we can learn from to apply or adapt in Canada. I'm trained as an environmental sociologist, which means I study the interactions between society and the natural environment, especially how environmental problems are created and solved. My focus has been on disaster governance. I'm fascinated by crises and disasters, even though they cause uncomfortable and inconvenient disruptions. They are also windows of opportunities for learning and changes. Governance here refers to the ways in which stakeholders make decisions, implement them, and interact with one another. In examining disaster governance, my main interest is in understanding perceptions, policies, practices, and participation, and the connections between them. I refer to them as the 4 Ps. Whether some stakeholders are invited to be part of the decision-making and to what extent their input shapes the solutions is also a key aspect of governance. How we perceive, or in other words, frame or define a problem influences the types of solutions we develop in terms of policies and practices. Frames are often expressed in images and metaphors. For example, if flooding is framed as the river intruding on people's property, then the likely solution is to constrain the river with dams and dikes. However, if flooding is framed as a natural event in locations where people have intruded the river space, or in other words, development is in the flood hazard areas, then the likely solution is to constrain people by improving land use and building practices rather than constraining the river. So framing is the act or process of creating these frames by weaving stories. As humans, we've been telling stories around fires and through cave drawings for thousands of years. Our brains are programmed for stories to create meaning and connect us. Combining my interest in research and storytelling, I begin with a story. Once upon a time, land far away, there was a flood so big and so destructive that the people of the land had never before seen. So the important people, called the bigwigs, decided to build large infrastructure for protecting the people. While the people appreciated being safe, some were angry, shouting that there had not been a proper gathering to talk about it. Nobody had asked them about their feelings of how this infrastructure would change their village, or how they felt about having to move away from their homes and neighbors. Also, nobody had asked them for their ideas. After all, they had come to know the waters, weather, wildlife, hills, and hollows, having lived there for a long time. They had some creative ideas and savvy solutions for different design options. Is this the story about Alberta? Or is this the story about the Netherlands? It's a story about both. Why I think this story is important is because it shows that despite many differences between Alberta and the Netherlands, some of the initial decisions and reactions to flooding were similar, with reactive infrastructure solutions and inadequate stakeholder engagement. Of course, these images are not to scale. If they were, the Netherlands would fit between Edmonton and Calgary. Around the world, most notably in Europe, including in the Netherlands, there's been a movement in riverine flood risk management away from fighting water towards a living with water approach because of the high cost of infrastructure building and maintenance and variable conditions resulting from climate change. Much of the Netherlands is reclaimed land that is below sea level. Traditionally, the Dutch have used structural measures such as dams and dikes to control the water. Without them, more than half of the Netherlands would be flooded. You have probably heard of the saying, God created the world, but the Dutch created Holland. This quote is referring to how the Dutch started to push back the sea to reclaim land to form their country. On a cold winter night in 1953, a huge storm blew into the North Sea. 1,835 people died, and tens and thousands of livestock perished in the Netherlands alone. To prevent such a disaster, the Dutch turned to hard engineering solutions to protect the land in the delta area from the sea, building infrastructure such as storm surge barriers, dams and dikes, etc., indicated by the blue lines. This is the delta works between late 1950s to 1990s and has been declared one of the 7 wonders of the modern world by the American Society of Civil Engineers. 40 years later, in 1993 and 1995, the Dutch rivers swelled to unprecedented levels. 250,000 people and 1 million livestock were evacuated. River dikes were quickly reinforced without environmental impact assessment or citizen engagement. The people were safer, but they were upset they had not been consulted and were concerned about the impact on nature. Criticism and discontent continued to grow. Over a decade later, as the effects of climate change became more pronounced, the Dutch recognized that continuing to build dikes higher and higher to further constrain the rivers was not the answer. The Dutch government was also aware that their earlier top-down approach would be strongly challenged by people advocating for social and environmental justice. The Dutch government shifted to multi-level governance, which included all levels of government and a broad range of stakeholders. The shift in governance required a lot of social innovation, such as working across administrative and disciplinary silos and more stakeholder collaboration. The Roam for the River approach was implemented from 2007 to 2017 by restoring landscapes along the river to allow more room for high water events by increasing river conveyance. One way to do this is by moving dikes. The Room for the River approach has 2 objectives. First, improved safety, and second, spatial quality such as environmental protection, aesthetics, and recreational value. 34 projects came in on time and within budget of 2.3 billion euros, which is about 3.2 billion Canadian dollars. Canada's approach to flood management has also shifted over time. After World War II, the emphasis was on structural adjustments such as dams and dikes. In 1970, the Federal Disaster Financial Assistance Arrangements Program was created to reimburse provincial governments for disaster damages. The cost of disaster assistance payments from the federal government to the provinces continued to increase. 5 years later, the Federal Flood Damage Reduction Program was developed to reduce disaster assistance payments and to facilitate the shift away from costly flood infrastructure towards prevention and non-structural flood mitigation measures. For example, the federal government provided funding for provinces to create flood hazard maps to discourage development in flood vulnerable areas. In 1999, the federal government ended the FDRP, consequently leaving flood damage reduction to provinces. However, the federal government continues to provide flood mapping guidelines and funding for mitigation projects. Then there was a period of paralysis and non-development between 1998 and 2006. In the last decade or so, the trend has been for the federal government to download increasing levels of responsibility to lower levels of government. In June of 2013, southern Alberta was severely flooded, impacting 32 communities, with the town of High River and the city of Calgary being the most impacted, and is estimated to have cost $6 billion in damages, which is the equivalent of 4.3 billion euros, so we could have almost paid for about 68 room for the river projects for that money. Now, Alberta has historically focused on structural measures for flood management. Did the 2013 Alberta floods trigger a shift? Yes, the high cost did trigger reassessment of structural solutions and exploration of other approaches, leading to 3 room for the river projects listed here: the town of High River, Bow River Basin, and the Red Deer River Basin. These 3 room for the river projects were designed with the assistance of the Dutch RfR Research Institute. RfR also informed the design of the stakeholder engagement for the 2 river basin projects, which were facilitated by Alberta WaterSmart, a consulting firm on behalf of the Alberta government. The High River Room for the River project purpose was to enhance the discharge capacity of the Highwood River. This project involved removing homes in 2 neighborhoods and several other obstacles. Parts of the river were also reshaped, and new dikes were built and existing ones were strengthened. The Bow River Basin Room for the River project purpose was to test whether the Room for the River philosophy and concepts are applicable. It remains conceptual because, other than a workshop to identify various options, these ideas have not yet been implemented. The finding was, though, that the Room for the River approach is also applicable in the Bow River Basin. The purpose of the 3rd Room for the River project, the Red Deer River Basin, was to ensure that the findings of the Bow River Basin project was not an anomaly, and to refine the process and include ice jams. It too remains conceptual. The finding was that the Room for the River approach is also applicable to other basins. In terms of public engagement, the decisions to relocate 2 neighborhoods in High River were made quickly by the Alberta government and High River Town Council without meaningful public engagement. We can look to Sinclair and colleagues about the criteria for meaningful engagement, which includes early and inclusive involvement of stakeholders, 2-way dialogue, transparency, and empowerment. In contrast, the Bow River Basin and Red Deer River Basin projects included in-depth dialogue and collaboration through workshops involving specific stakeholders such as technical working groups, watershed groups, and user groups. However, the public was able to provide only limited feedback on the draft basin project reports. I'll come back to the topic of engagement later. In my doctoral research on Alberta's 2013 floods, I heard 3 main reasons Albertans were interested in the Dutch approach to Room for the River and applying it in Alberta. An opportunity to shift towards environmental sustainability, more meaningful citizen engagement, and more collaboration. The following is a quote from one of my Alberta interviewees, which captures the high level of support for the Room for the River approach. But in a flood, you can get out of the way. We've got to stop. The whole Daltaris report, Room for the River, it makes sense. We have to buy into that. We have to embrace that as a community, as a province and country. But how do we do that? So this weary researcher, being relentlessly driven by curiosity, set off to find the answers by traveling to a land far, far away across oceans and mountains, to the land of the water gods, as the Dutch are known around the world for their water engineering skills, and the land of windmills, which remind us of their long history of managing water dating back over 1,000 years, and in which Dutch democracy was built, developing the polder model. This means they keep talking and talking until they find a solution that everyone can live with. And the land of cheese, which I unfortunately had to restrain myself from. We may be surprised to learn that this tiny country 16 times smaller than Alberta, is the world's second largest exporter of agricultural and food products. Only the US is larger. And the land of tulips, my favorite flowers. The Netherlands is considered one of the most feminine countries in the world based on the Hofstede Index of Cultural Dimensions. Feminine does not mean that the men look like women. On the contrary, I've never seen so many tall men. Feminine means that their dominant values in society are caring for others, collective well-being, and the quality of life are signs of success rather than individuality and standing out in a crowd, which is considered not admirable. My quest was to find the answer to the burning question, how do we adapt the Dutch room for the river approach in Alberta to make more room for rivers and voices? Alberta, oh Alberta, the land of the original water engineers, which we continue to kill off because they mess with the water flows, while other countries are reintroducing them to help with management, for example, the UK. Land of the third largest oil reserves, which is contributing to climate change. Land of cows, which outnumbers humans by 3 times, and the land of farmers who have a lot of say and power in land use. We also export a lot of agricultural products. And the land of nuts, symbolic of masculinity. You can see fake testicles hanging off the back of this truck, sometimes seen in Alberta. Alberta also has a very strong culture of property rights. Overall, Canada's masculinity score is high, which means it's a society driven by competition, achievement, and success is defined in terms of winners. This is just a brief description of some of the cultural aspects that are important for influencing flood risk governance and its ultimate success. According to the literature, unlike transferable technological change, the room for the river approach requires fundamental institutional, governance, and cultural change, and hence is more challenging to implement. Given that the room for the river approach was perceived as opening a path for institutionalizing a more comprehensive flood risk management system in Alberta, I asked, what are the factors for shifting flood management paradigms and practices to adapt the Dutch room for the river approach in Alberta? I compared and contrasted results from 38 interviews in Alberta and 12 in the Netherlands, with a focus on the social dimensions of flood risk governance. I toured the High River area and several projects in the Netherlands. I also reviewed numerous reports and policy documents. According to research on Room for the River by Zevenbergen et al., implementation of this approach in other countries is sometimes hampered by a fragmented institutional context and a lack of political will to do things differently from the past, and also hampered when the governance culture and existing policy and regulation are not aligned with this new approach. I came upon the transition governance framework developed by Farrelly et al. On the operational factors supporting transition governance, and it fit well with the themes from my research findings. In the model by Farrelly et al., governance captures the dynamic interaction between the processes listed on your right and structures listed on your left, required to steer and manage society. I'll speak about 7 of the 8 factors. I will leave out a detailed discussion of regulatory and compliance agenda, since that requires a whole separate session. So Farrelly et al. Found that these 8 factors of operational governance demonstrated a strong interplay between the structures and processes, so left and right, suggesting that there's a need to have all factors aligned before a system-wide transition can be successfully expedited. I'll begin with narratives and frames. The Dutch have clear narratives about flood management. They say, we have a united common goal, keep our feet dry. There's a nationwide acceptance that flood protection is the country's biggest concern for wealth and health. There's also a Dutch saying, the dike is of us all, meaning the dike is part of their culture and daily living, and maintaining it is everybody's responsibility. So for example, if muskrats are making holes, call the water board. This picture is of the Nijmegen Room for the River project that won international prizes, but it started out with significant local resistance. This was because the national government came up with a design and then engaged the public. The citizens rejected it, and they had to start from the beginning with all the stakeholders involved. You can see public space created for festivities and recreation in the middle of the city. It's so beautiful, and it really is. I had a chance to see it, that the city is attracting an increasing number of residents and businesses. If you're familiar with the International Association for Public Participation, or IAP2 spectrum, the initial top-down approach of the national government would be categorized more as informing, but then with the second attempt, it was empowerment, where the stakeholders became involved. In Alberta, there was no united goal, but rather varied interests. Flood drought cycles make it difficult to decide what infrastructure to invest in. Flood risk management infrastructure is not part of our culture, and angry rivers and Albertans are strong and resilient. Those were the narratives on the covers of books and t-shirts and other messages after the flood for several years because we were still in the recovery phase of the disaster. Those kinds of narratives better fit with a warrior spirit, fighting water, than living with water. The Dutch Room for the River program has dual objectives, safety and spatial quality, as I mentioned earlier. The national government established the safety requirements of water levels, and within these standards, local governments, water boards, and residents had opportunities to design the project to fit their local needs and wants. This is an excellent example of engaging stakeholders at the level of empowerment rather than merely informing, if you think of the IAP2 spectrum. Freedom within borders. This is an expression to communicate that borders are the flood safety measures and money and time frame, and freedom is in the design. There was more of a bottom-up approach than in the past, and the budget is separated from the political cycle. The Dutch say that the flooding issue is too important to be left to politicians. In Alberta, respecting our rivers rather than room for the river is the main flood mitigation approach, and it does not include all aspects of spatial quality like the Dutch. It's more of a top-down approach, and the budget is not divorced from the political cycle. Now, economics is also really important. So Room for the River is also about economics, using national money for local projects, which they say is an offer you can't refuse. And there's a planning kit called a Block and Dose computer program that has helped to turn what's seen initially as threats into opportunities. So to go from not in my backyard to please in my backyard. Participants that were involved would be able to play with this program and see how different measures implemented would change the outcomes. In Alberta, Dalthar's report in 2015 found that the Alberta Engineering Company's initial recommendations for Highwood River flood diversion and dam were expensive, morphologically unsustainable, and did not justify the social cost. This is one reason the town of High River ended up with the Room for the River project instead, which paid off because the summer of 2014, so 1 year after the flood, there was some more flooding in the Wallaceville neighborhood. You see a picture. Now, I won't go through each of the leaders involved in the Dutch Room for the River program. The takeaway is that there were prominent and identifiable leaders who championed the Room for the River project. I will highlight Ingvar de Boer, who was the first director of the Room for the River program and was identified as the reasons for the program's success. Mr. de Boer was said to be able to bring stakeholders together that others could not. There were also two farmer chairmen who negotiated, organized, and built trust between farmers and the government, but ended up with health issues because of the stress of so many years of doing it. Therefore, it's very important to acknowledge how difficult it is to deal with different stakeholder interests. In Alberta, there wasn't really a specific identified leader or champion for the Room for the River projects, probably because the buyouts were surrounded by controversy. The mayor of High River was sometimes quoted in the media for supporting the buyouts in Wallaceville, but there was less support for buying out other neighborhoods in High River. As I mentioned earlier, Alberta WaterSmart was contracted by the Government of Alberta to conduct two conceptual Room for the River studies. If you look for news articles on these, it's usually the director of Alberta WaterSmart, Kim Sturdes, who's quoted. In the Netherlands, in terms of capacity, there were many opportunities for networking and learning. There were many informal networks And there were many events to share knowledge and success, to even talk about some of the challenges and for problem solving, and to build relationships so people can reach out for advice. The Dutch were also self-critical and reflective, admitting mistakes and figuring out how to address shortfalls. The Room for the River program included role-playing simulation to improve collaboration. In terms of the two conceptual river basin projects in Alberta, there were these workshops which included water experts, but not the general public. There was a lot of technical learning, and the participants really appreciated the breadth of topics and perspectives, and they wanted more such opportunities. Now, in the Netherlands, the public engagement varied by project, and some lasted between 2 to 4 years. Overall, the Room for the River program was a 10-year program, so many projects took that long. There's a real emphasis on understanding the social aspects. For example, as one interviewee said, it's important to have an attitude of respect for people living there and acknowledging how relocating changes their lives. The residents were supported not just with money, as in market value of their property, but also helping find new homes, accommodating small wishes such as building a fence or bike lane, because then people were less likely to block project which delays the project and costs more money. In the Netherlands, relocation was mandatory. Out of 154 relocations, only about 3 went to court and only 1 was decided by the judge. That's a high success rate. In designing community meetings, they said, don't come to us, we'll come to you. So they located temporary offices in the community so people could drop by and have coffee and express grievances about projects that were being built that could then quickly be addressed. They also designed community meetings to have a market atmosphere and and having kitchen table talks, so going to residents' homes. So it's very personable. Here's a picture of traditional pastry made by the locals that they brought to one of the meetings. In Alberta, there were numerous public engagement events at the municipal and provincial levels. Decisions for buyouts were made within a year. The benefit of this is it reduces the length of time of uncertainty, which creates stress, but at the same time, it did not give much time for residents to mentally and emotionally prepare for moving. The town hall meetings in High River were described as anger management sessions. You can see from the pictures that the citizens were more likely to throw tomatoes than they were to bake pastries. One reason was because of the heightened emotions shortly after the flood, which I talk about more in a publication I'll mention later. There were other reasons as well for the heightened emotions. So the open house formats did not allow for two-way in-depth dialogue that's more in common in workshop formats. Also, the public feedback opportunities were via feedback forms, social media, online surveys, rather than as two-way dialogue. In Alberta, 254 homes located in flood-affected areas in the floodway were eligible for voluntary buyouts at the provincial level, but only had a 33% success rate. Having said that, buyouts were mandated by the High River Municipal Government. When looking at the public participation spectrum, the Dutch approach was more towards empowerment and the Alberta approach was more towards informing. In the Netherlands, all the rivers are mapped. This is possible because the Netherlands is 16 times smaller than Alberta. In 1995, the national government passed regulation to restrict development in floodplains. So when development is allowed in the floodplain, you can see in this picture that the entrance is on the second floor and these buildings are floodproof. In the other picture, you see the High Water Flood Risk Awareness Campaign. So residents could enter their postal code on a website and find out how high the flood levels would be. They were asked to put a blue tape to mark the potential water level and then take a picture and post it on Twitter. This campaign won international awards for engagement. In Alberta, the river sections that are mapped is where it's most densely populated. In December 2013, the government of Alberta enacted the Flood Recovery and Reconstruction Act, which enabled the development of regulations to limit floodway development. But almost 6 years later, the resultant floodway development regulation has not been put into effect. And also, residents don't necessarily understand what their flood risks are and don't know how to read their maps. my colleagues at the University of Waterloo, Thistlethwaite, Henstra, and Scott, conducted a study of 2,300 households across Canada in designated flood risk areas. Only 6% were aware of their high flood risk. The conclusion to this story thus far is that based on the Transition Governance Framework by Farrelly et al., my research found strong support for the Room for the River approach in Alberta. The two conceptual river basin studies, so the Red Deer River Basin and the Bow River Basin, found that the Room for the River philosophy concepts are also applicable to other watershed basins. In the Netherlands, more of the operational factors have aligned for a system-wide transition to facilitate the successful implementation of the Room for the River projects than in Alberta. Therefore, my conclusion thus far is that in Alberta, further transition is not likely to occur while there is considerable misalignment in the factors supporting transition governance. I also asked the Dutch if they have any advice for Alberta, and they said, the Dutch Room for the River is a paradigm shift. It's difficult to transfer this way of thinking and philosophy. And in the Netherlands, flood protection is a state of mind. They also said, protect the environment. Please don't do like the Dutch. There's plenty of room for your rivers. Keep it that way, as opposed to building dikes higher and higher and then having to move them. In terms of public engagement, a specialist said the first step is very important. When I look back, the first step has to be a common step, a step together with the people. The question is on the table, not the solution. In other words, you come up with a solution together. So the Dutch heavily invested upfront in terms of time and effort to make things run smoother and faster later. It's interesting that the Dutch advice aligned with what Albertans valued from the Dutch Room for the River approach, which I mentioned earlier, such as environmental sustainability, public engagement, and collaboration. Now, if you would like to have a one-page summary of this presentation, you can find it on my website under the blog tab. There are also other publications on my flooding research available on the publications tab. On my website, you can find information on the assessment of the public engagement approach in Alberta I mentioned earlier, where the river was for community disaster preparedness, and there'll be some information in 2020 on Flood Resilience Challenge game I co-designed with Heather Murdoch from Northwest Hydraulic Consultants. Thank you.
Thank you, Evelina, for that awesome presentation. We do have some questions coming in now, and the first question that we'd like to ask is, how do we encourage governments to change their perceptions and behaviors about public engagement?
Thank you, Shirey. That's definitely a challenge. Governments, especially elected officials, politicians, want to be associated with success and to shine. They want to avoid failing and being embarrassed. So, for example, the expansion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline project was stalled through the courts because the federal government did not adequately consult First Nations. As I mentioned earlier, initially the Dutch Nijmegen Room for the River project was also stalled when the national government tried a top-down approach. The people demanded better engagement. So when the people rejected the initial plan and the government then ended up engaging the stakeholders, it became a better design, which resulted in international awards and attention. In speaking to the Dutch Room for the River about their engagement process, they acknowledged when mistakes had been made, and that's the first step to learning. And the second is a willingness to improve. So those involved in engagement recognize that putting the time in for proper engagement up front resulted in projects that came in on time and within budget because there were less stalls. And this is not new. Early and inclusive involvement of stakeholders is among the best practices for public engagement as well as project management.
Thank you, Evelina. Our next question is, do you have any insights as to best practices regarding home buyouts as a flood risk reduction strategy?
That's a good question. Where I can draw from is the Dutch and the Alberta examples. In the Netherlands, even though the buyouts were mandatory, they still started the conversation in a more participatory way. So the public engagement specialists went into the communities, they spent time talking to people, and they had the time they didn't have to worry about immediate threat, and tried to put people in their comfort zones. And that was the exact expression used by one of the Dutch interviewees, and they negotiated that way. So it was more on the empowerment end of the IAP2 spectrum. In Alberta, buyouts were voluntary at the provincial level, but mandatory at the municipal level. So the communication of buyouts was more the informed strategy rather than the two-way dialogue. In Alberta, there's also a very strong culture of property rights and less emphasis on collective well-being like there is in the Netherlands. So these regulatory and cultural differences are some of the factors which contributed to Alberta being less successful in buyouts right from the start because of those differences. And what I learned from the Dutch is that having regulations in place, along with taking the time to negotiate in a way that was more along the empowerment end of the spectrum, resulted in higher success.
Thank you, Evelina. The Netherlands seems like quite a unique case of flood management. They face a significant risk unlike most other jurisdictions and are willing to put significant resources towards risk reduction. How can we generalize their experience to jurisdictions with less political will and resources?
Yes, there's certainly many differences between the Dutch and the Canadian context. I mentioned the research by Zevenberg and colleagues who have demonstrated that the room for the river approach requires institutional, governance, and cultural changes, and that implementation of the room for the river approach is, they have also found, often hampered by fragmented institutional context and lack of political will and the existing governance culture. So while the Dutch faced severe coastal flooding, which could put 2/3 of the Netherlands underwater, the room for the river approach is actually for riverine flooding, the risk is substantial, but not as much of an existential issue as the coastal flooding. So I think it's important to remember that many actions were taken that are captured in the 8 factors of the transition governance framework. So those were the narratives or frames, the policy and planning, economics, leadership, capacity building, public engagement, research, and so forth. So I think we can still look at those 8 factors and think about how we can apply those in other contexts.
Thank you. Our next question is, after clearing out communities out of high rivers, floodway, and flood fringe lands in the Highwood Valley, the town now proposes to expand dikes into the similar lands within the Little Bow River branch close to where the river diverts. How can this be justified with the broad Deltaris recommendation?
That is a difficult question that I'm not going to attempt to answer, as there are many people that would be better suited to answer that question.
Sure, absolutely. And I think we can wrap the presentation up with this last question. What 3 takeaways can we use from the Dutch experience that would be applicable in the Canadian context?
So I'll come back to the 8 factors in the transition governance framework again. And it's hard to choose just 3 out of those 8. But if I had to choose, I would choose regulations. So in the 1990s, prior to the Room for the River program, the Dutch government created regulations to restrict floodplain development and made buyouts mandatory. So that was a top-down approach, but they also had the bottom-up approach later on. The stakeholder engagement was incorporated into the Room for the River projects, and those were more on the empowerment end of the IAP2 spectrum. So this resulted in higher participation in the buyouts and also ownership of the Room for the River project, in which stakeholders were able to contribute to the design. So overall, the Dutch use this mixed approach of top-down and bottom-up, and collaborative approaches may seem like they'll take longer, but as demonstrated in 34 of the projects and of the Room for the River, that it actually sped up the approach because there was more buy-in and ownership and less stalling of the project. They also created space for more collaborative approaches by bringing together different perspectives, which actually ended up having better results and a more innovative design. And I would say, so in addition to the regulations and the public engagement, economics is really important in terms of separating the budget for flooding from political cycles and also being able to demonstrate the economic benefits of buyouts. Another aspect of economics is who wins and loses, though. So one of the issues in Alberta is the misalignment in risk apportionment, meaning that the stakeholders responsible for developing in areas with high flood risk are not necessarily those that end up paying for the flood disaster damages. But that is another session in itself.
Thank you, Evelina. And I want to thank everyone for participating and listening in today's webinar. We'll wrap things up once again by saying thank you to our presenter, Evelina Bogdan. If you're interested in learning more about the Canadian Coastal Resilience Forum, please visit our website at uwaterloo.ca/Canadian-coastal-resilience or contact myself, Shari Kotar, at scottar@uwaterloo.ca. We will be sending out a link to the recording in a follow-up email within the next week. Once again, I'd like to thank our presenter, Evelina Bogdan, and our facilitator, Cindy Marvin, for a great webinar. We hope you enjoyed today's webinar presented by Miopart and the Canadian Coastal Resilience Forum. Thank you.